October 27, 1962. 4,000 feet below the surface of the Caribbean Sea, 3 Soviet officers stand in a metal coffin filled with nuclear fire. The submarine is B-59. The weapon, a nuclear torpedo with the power to vaporize an American aircraft carrier and everyone aboard. Outside, 11 U.S. Navy destroyers drop depth charges. Inside, the temperature has reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is suffocating, hallucinating, dying. Captain Valentin Savitsky screams the order, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." 2 officers reach for the launch authorization. The third refuses. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. And this is the moment when one man's conscience prevented World War III. To understand why Arkipov's decision mattered, you need to understand just how close we came to extinction. October 1962. The world population, 3.1 billion people. None of them knew that in 13 days, most of them could be dead. The mathematics of nuclear war were simple and horrifying. The United States possessed 3,500 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union, 3,300. Combined destructive power, 75,000 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Strategic planners in both countries had calculated the aftermath. 200 million dead in the first 72 hours. Nuclear winter for those who survived. The end of human civilization as a functioning concept. And it all began with a secret. On October 14, an American U-2 spy plane photographed something in the Cuban countryside that changed everything. Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles. In Cuba. 90 miles from Miami. From these launch sites, nuclear warheads could reach Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. New York, 11 minutes. Chicago, 16. President John F. Kennedy was shown the photographs on October 16. His military advisors presented their recommendation, immediate invasion of Cuba. But invasion meant war with Cuba. War with Cuba meant war with the Soviet Union. And war with the Soviet Union meant nuclear Armageddon. Kennedy chose a naval blockade instead. He called it a quarantine, a ring of U.S. Navy ships surrounding Cuba. No Soviet vessels would be allowed through. In Moscow, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced an impossible choice: back down and appear weak, or challenge the blockade and risk nuclear war. What neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev knew was that 4 Soviet submarines were already approaching the blockade line. And each one carried a secret that would have changed everything. October 1, 1962. The Soviet Northern Fleet dispatched 4 submarines to Cuba. Their mission: support the secret missile installations and establish a naval base. But these weren't ordinary submarines. Each one carried a weapon the Americans didn't know existed. The T-5 nuclear torpedo. 1 torpedo, 10 kilotons of explosive power. That's 2/3 the strength of the Hiroshima bomb. In a single conventional weapon. And here's what made the situation genuinely apocalyptic: the submarine captains had authorization to use these weapons. Without direct orders from Moscow. Under normal circumstances, launching a nuclear weapon required approval from the Soviet High Command. But these submarines would be out of communication range. So Moscow gave the captains authority to launch if they believed war had already begun. 3 officers aboard each submarine had to agree: the captain, the political officer, and the second captain. 2 votes were all that separated peace from nuclear war. The second captain of Submarine B-59 was Vasili Arkhipov. And he was the wrong man to send if you wanted that button pressed. 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Arkhipov had survived something that should have killed him. July 4, 1961. The nuclear submarine K-19 suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant failure during exercises in the North Atlantic. Arkhipov was the executive officer. Without coolant, the reactor core began to melt down. The temperature inside reached 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit. If the core melted through the hull, the submarine would sink with its nuclear warheads aboard. Or worse, the reactor could explode, creating a nuclear detonation that would be detected by NATO forces, an explosion that could trigger World War III through sheer misunderstanding. The captain ordered 8 men into the reactor compartment to build an emergency cooling system. By hand. In lethal radiation. All 8 men died. Slowly. Horribly. Their skin blistering and sloughing off. Internal organs liquefying. Arkhipov watched them die. He attended their funerals. He carried that weight. The experience taught him something the Soviet Naval Command had never intended: that nuclear weapons don't just threaten the enemy. They threaten everyone. Including the men who carry them. And now, barely a year later, he was back underwater, heading toward Cuba, carrying a nuclear weapon, with orders that gave him the power to use it. October 27, 1962. Submarine B-59 had been submerged for 5 days. The submarine was designed to stay submerged for 5 days maximum. Then surface, run diesel generators, recharge batteries, replenish air supply, and cool the vessel. But B-59 couldn't surface, because the U.S. Navy had found them. 11 destroyers surrounded the submarine. They were dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant to signal, "We know you're down there. Surface immediately." But the Soviet crew didn't know they were practice charges. They thought they were under attack. Inside B-59, conditions became unbearable. The air conditioning had failed. Carbon dioxide levels were reaching toxic concentrations. The temperature climbed to 122, 130, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Some suffered cardiac events. The ship's medic moved from body to body, checking for signs of life, rationing water from the nuclear reactor's emergency supply. They'd lost radio contact with Moscow days earlier. For all Captain Savitsky knew, World War III had already begun. The depth charges could be the opening salvo of a nuclear attack on Soviet forces. In the command center, 3 men faced the decision. Captain Valentin Savitsky had reached his breaking point. According to crew testimony given years later, Savitsky believed war had begun. He believed his duty was clear. He gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed. 2 votes. That should have been enough. But Submarine B-59 had a unique command structure. Arkhipov wasn't just second captain. He was the chief of staff for the entire flotilla. Equal rank to Savitsky. Which meant all 3 officers had to agree. Arkhipov said no. The argument that followed lasted hours. Savitsky raged. Maslenikov invoked Soviet honor and duty. But Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. His reasoning was simple: they didn't know if war had begun. They couldn't communicate with Moscow. Launching the nuclear torpedo based on assumption would guarantee the very war they were trying to prevent. Savitsky could have overruled him. Could have launched anyway. But something in Arkhipov's certainty, perhaps the memory of K-19, perhaps simple moral authority, made him hesitate. Finally, Savitsky made his decision. B-59 would surface. When B-59 surfaced on the night of October 27, the American ships were waiting. Searchlights illuminated the Soviet submarine. 11 destroyers. Thousands of sailors. Weapons trained on the vessel. The Americans had no idea what they were looking at. They thought B-59 was a conventional diesel submarine. They had no idea it carried a nuclear weapon. No idea how close they'd come to being vaporized. B-59 recharged its batteries, restored its air supply, and departed. The crisis ended 4 days later when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American missiles leaving Turkey. Kennedy and Khrushchev were praised for their restraint, for stepping back from the brink. But they didn't know about Arkhipov. Nobody did. The world celebrated the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the real hero remained 4,000 feet underwater, unknown and unheralded. For 40 years, the story remained classified. Locked in Soviet archives. Known only to the men who were there. Then, in 2002, at a conference in Havana commemorating the 40th anniversary of the crisis, the truth finally emerged. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, was there when Soviet veterans revealed what had happened aboard B-59. His words, "A guy named Arkhipov saved the world." The revelation sent shockwaves through the historical community. Every analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis had missed the most dangerous moment. The moment when nuclear war wasn't prevented by diplomacy, but by one man's conscience. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, was at that 2002 conference. When he heard the story, he turned pale. Because the Americans had a standing plan: if the Soviets used nuclear weapons, even tactically, the United States would launch a full strategic nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Which would trigger Soviet retaliation. Which would kill hundreds of millions of people. One torpedo. One decision. Between civilization and extinction. Vasili Arkhipov died in 1998. He was 72 years old. He received no medal for what he did on October 27, 1962. The Soviet government never publicly acknowledged the incident. When he died, the world barely noticed. But today, 8 billion people live on this planet. 8 billion lives that might never have existed if Arkhipov had voted differently. Every child born after 1962. Every discovery made. Every work of art created. Every moment of love, joy, sorrow, triumph, all of it hanging by the thread of one man's refusal. Historians now believe there were at least 3 moments during the Cold War when the world came within minutes of nuclear annihilation. 3 times we survived by accident, by luck, by individual courage in the face of systemic madness. Arkhipov's story reminds us of something terrifying and magnificent, that the survival of human civilization can rest on a single person's choice. That one individual, in one moment, can change everything. Vasili Arkhipov was not a pacifist, he was not a rebel, he was a Soviet naval officer who followed orders his entire career. But when the orders stopped making sense, when the protocols led to madness, he found the courage to say no. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty isn't following orders, it's refusing them. And sometimes one person, standing firm in the darkness, is all that separates us from the abyss.